Sure. Karl Katz Lydén, Critique and the Care of the Self, Foucault, which is your thesis. You're going back to Foucault's readings and lectures on early Greek and Roman philosophy, and I think a lot of people were surprised when he, in the late 70s, he turned to ancient philosophy. But you want to show that this shift in Foucault's work is in fact connected to the present. So I was wondering how do you see this kind of general shift in Foucault's late work?
I think that while many have surely understood it as a kind of ethical turn, this interest in ancient philosophy and the notions of the care of the self and truth-telling, I think that it is an intensely political project, and it could even be articulated in critical terms or in terms of critique. And I think maybe one reason why many have come to conclude that it is a kind of ethical turn or a shift away from politics towards ethics as a kind of first philosophy. I think that was maybe facilitated by just reading the second and third volumes of the History of Sexuality, whereas I look at the lectures at the Collège de France and mainly the last 3 years, and there it's actually very clear that this subjectivity at stake in his late work is not about an individual ethical subject in ancient Greek or Roman times, but it is also valid or applicable to a notion of a collective political subjectivity today, and that's clear in a number of ways, actually.
I mean, we'll get back to that. How do you see the connection to the present? But I think a lot of people have been struck by also the shift in style. Obviously Foucault's lectures are, they're pretty easy to read. They are not your traditional image of French philosophy, which is very convoluted and literary. He has a very clear and crisp style. But even having said that, these lectures are a bit different because it's very descriptive and very, it's very close. Sometimes you feel like he's reading through a straw, in this ancient text. I mean, how do you see this shift? I mean, on the stylistic level.
Well, it's very true what you say about the shift. I mean, the shift in style in Foucault is first and foremost, I think, from his early and mid work, and then the shift occurs with the late work, which would be the last second and third volume of the History of Sexuality, which is much less dramatic, much less literary in a way, and there's much less going on in terms of archival material being put to use. But also in the lectures there is a shift, I think that one of my points or things that I would like to suggest is that the shift in style is actually relevant to how you can understand and read his work, and whereas his earlier work was a kind of critique in the sense that it to some degree represented forms of subjection, assujettissement, and the disciplinary society developing during the 17th and 18th, 19th century. Here it is something else going on, and in terms of style, when he's much more searching for the words, he's going back and forth a bit, and I think the reason is that he's no longer trying to give an image or representation of the workings of power, but rather, and how that forms subjects, but rather he's looking for ways to describe ways of subjectivation, that the subject can ways in which the subject can constitute itself.
I mean, it's also, in a certain sense, he's not on his home turf, because, I mean, normally he will produce vast, as it were, synthetic sketches of a lot of material. Here he's very close to the stuff. I mean, in a certain sense, he's also approaching, texts that are a bit foreign to him. I mean, doesn't normally refer to Euripides or Plato, so he's much closer. He's a close reader, which is perhaps surprising here.
Yeah, he is, and I think for sure that also affects the sort of the way in which his lectures unfold, and whereas the earlier work where he would still engage more with let's say like archival material, like let's say court rulings and so on, and prison, text about prison inmates and whatever workings and so on, regulations and so forth. I think now he is shifting away from that kind of way of working to another way, which affects very much his way of philosophizing, his way of developing his thought.
So I mean, if one looks, for instance, at his readings of Plato, I mean, obviously there is an infinite literature in Plato, but still I think he produces a very original reading, because he doesn't really go into the grand metaphysical claims. He even says that the text like the Republic is a parody. He looks to more obscure, marginal texts. He produces a reading which I would say is very uncommon. I mean, how do you see that? He produces a really different images of many of the philosophers. Is that controversial? I guess it is, or is it?
I think it's important to remember that when Plato has been fairly read and researched.
Fairly well read, yes.
Yeah,
to be sure.
But he is, when he's turning to these ancient sources, he's looking at texts from Hellenistic philosophy and so on that were not really so much studied as they are today,
true.
Including the Cynics and Epicureans and Stoics, and he goes very much his own way with these readings, and maybe in a sense, he is a kind of his Plato readings. For instance, I mean, maybe you're thinking about when he's looking at the letters, the letter 7, the letter 8, and so on.
I think a particular passage, I don't know exactly where, I don't remember now, but he says somewhere that he's going to not go into the grand metaphysical claims, as said, because he conceives of them more as a kind of parody. They are not the core of Plato, which is what most readers would say, this is the core of Plato.
I think
it's a political Plato in a very practical sense.
He does. He takes. I guess he sort of he takes what he needs to. Sometimes he also takes what he needs to make his argument, and he, for instance, focuses less on parts of Plato which does not really confirm his idea about this, because he articulates this break with Hellenistic philosophy and so on, within the term of the care of the self, for this notion.
I have this feeling that what he wants to, the kind of portrait he wants to make is a philosopher in the world. It's not a philosopher thinking about substance and being and causality in time and space, but it's a philosopher who's engaged with the tyrant, with being an advisor, being part of social life. So it's a philosopher as a kind of public intellectual more, which is in some sense makes it less relevant to look at the metaphysical theories. So in that sense, it's a very practical Plato.
Absolutely,
Socratic Plato, perhaps. There's also a lot of great readings of Socrates, which I think is interesting, which is, I don't know what to say about them, but they are perhaps more recognizable than the ones readings of Plato. But when you say that, so he is a Plato, or the others as well, they are philosophers in the world, they are part of the social fabric, they are engaged with practices, and this is of course a very Foucauldian take on philosophy. But it's interesting to see how that connects, which is also a bit surprising, to Kant and the Enlightenment, which is like a second pole in this historical drama. You have the notion of Öffentlichkeit, of public sphere, of public life, and the idea of enlightenment. So I think some people would be, at least people who have read Foucault, less well, who are surprised to see Foucault as a champion of the Enlightenment. And a Kantian Enlightenment as well, which is not what. The very standard picture of Foucault would not be that. So how do you see that?
No, that's true. That there have been many to say that Foucault was a critic of the Enlightenment, or that he was, against the Enlightenment. To which he himself responded that it would be ridiculous to, it's a blackmail kind of ridiculous way of putting the question as if you are for or against the Enlightenment. It happened, and then we have to relate to it. But I think here, he's taking up Kant's text, Was ist Aufklärung? That's what he focuses on in the late lectures, and this is a text that comes back many times in his late work, and sort of connects many different parts of his late work. And one thing that is interesting about this is that when he's, for instance, he's talking about the ancient Greek and Roman notions of paresia, truth-telling, and the care of the self, epimeleia hiautu, or cura sui in Latin. And then all of a sudden in 1983, he sort of starts his lectures by talking about this context, just all of a sudden, and then he devotes a lecture to this, and then boom, gone, basically, yeah. But he, I mean, what he does say when he's reading Kant is that what Kant is doing, asking the question, what is enlightenment, he is turning to his own present.
Yeah.
And that, so obviously I think that's what he's trying to say, this is what I'm doing too, despite the fact that I'm talking about ancient philosophy, Plato and Socrates and so on. And so that's one thing that this inclusion of Kant does. And another thing is that this Was ist Aufklärung, what is enlightenment text of Kant is the sort of theoretical fundament for Foucault's own lecture that he gave in 1978 called What is Critique? Yeah. So a kind of Foucauldian critique is being articulated on Kant's idea of enlightenment, or asking the question, what is enlightenment? And this is connected by Foucault. This is put together with his work on ancient philosophy and the care of the self. And this is one of the ways in which I try to demonstrate that these are maybe not two connected projects, but in a way one and the same.
I think it is in that context, maybe in one of the lectures, or perhaps also in one of the several essays on Kant and the Enlightenment, where he makes this distinction between two traditions of modern philosophy. And one is he calls the analytical truth, which is like early Husserl, early analytic philosophy, which goes to analytic philosophy, and then there's a tradition from Max Weber going through the Frankfurt School and others, and he says, I belong, at least there he says, I belong to this other school, which he calls the ontology of actuality, history of present. So I think also people were surprised, at least when he said that in the early 80s, late 70s, because the Frankfurt School wasn't really known in French philosophy, that he perceived himself as belonging to that tradition. I mean, so I think that's also a surprising statement.
Yes, it is, and that's true. But one should also perhaps recall that the same year that he gave this lecture, What is Critique, and which was the first time that he engaged with this Kantian What is Enlightenment text, he was also starting lecturing on the territory security population lectures, and then the next year he turned to the one called What is The Birth of Biopolitics, and there he actually turns to the form of government today as it has developed in economical, rational terms since the Enlightenment, which would be liberal capitalism, or what he focuses mainly on, neoliberalism. The birth of neoliberalism would be the better title of those lectures.
I mean, this lecture from 78, right? 77, 78.
79 is the birth of politics, right?
I have occasionally a lot of discussion, because there are a lot of people saying there's a kind of liberal turn in Foucault, and even he turns into a neoliberal, which would then square well with the idea that it's an ethical turn to also self for the individual subject. But you really oppose that reading. I mean, don't you think there are any grounds for suggesting that still? I mean, there are a lot of statements that would would underwrite this reading.
I find it very difficult to to understand it that way. When you look at even when you look at the lectures on neoliberalism, they are mainly somewhat distanced and descriptive
really.
and so on. But even so, sometimes you can fear he sort of I can't remember the term now, but he talks about the threat or risk or something like this. He also actually puts he takes up this idea of like basic general income idea, which was proposed by French neoliberals at the time, and he basically put it in terms very close to Marx's idea of like a reserve army of labor, and a kind of a population completely without any kind of security and so on. And I think it's difficult to say that this is something he calls for, or that he supports. So in that sense, to me, he seems pretty critical of neoliberalism as it's being developed. And then one must remember that he's writing this before Reagan, Thatcher, and so on. Sure. So that's one thing. And another thing, I guess, about the neoliberal, Foucault as a neoliberal, is that, because as you said, some of those people who have been trying to propose Foucault as a kind of neoliberal with his late work on the care of the self, they have often thought of the care of the self as something individual. But that simply, that does not simply not hold up.
No.
If you read what he says in the lectures, and now we have them, published, and there he does actually very clearly articulate the care of the self as a kind of collective project. It is something you always do in a relation, in a school, in a sect, in a group, or something like this, or at least with at least one other. So,
Sure. I mean, the care of self is always like an intersubjective practice, even though these forms of intersubjectivity might change. But I'm thinking of the connection between, when he lectures on the birth of politics, it's the only time when it really comes into the present. He speaks about the late 70s in France, about Giscard d'Estaing and other things. Then he cuts this off and goes back to antiquity. So there's an obvious break here so I was wondering, how do you see this? I mean, some people say he was basically bored with the idea of biopolitics, he gave it up, so he did something else. But how, what is his connection, I was asked, between this really rare moment of engagement with the present and then the radical shift back to something that he has never talked about before? Is there continuity here, or does it really change his mind? Or
that is a very difficult question, and I don't have a great answer for it, I think. But
I think one answer would be say that in the lectures on birth of biopolitics, he speaks about this, human capital, Gary Becker, and all these things, which is a kind of less, as it were, neoliberal form of subjectivation. It is how the subject is construed and constructed in late capital society. Everyone is an entrepreneur. That's how it works. So you could say, okay, so he wants to see, how did we end up there? We must go back and see how other forms of subjectivation have occurred. So in that sense, he would say, okay, here we are. How do we end up here? So he goes back. Is that a possible reading?
It is for sure a possible reading, but maybe one should be a bit, because he also starts that whole movement which goes back to antiquity about the forms of subjectivation and so on. I mean, I guess it started in 76 with the first volume of the History of Sexuality, so which is a bit before that, where he talks about or he writes about the confession and as a kind of form of subjectivation, where the individual is constituting him or herself. But here it is a kind of obligatory truth-telling, and this is what changes with the late work. But, I mean, rather perhaps the movement back to antiquity, or it may also be motivated by. I do think that the whole definition of philosophy is at stake for Foucault, whereas he is in his earlier work trying to demonstrate how forms of government and workings of power work, he is in the later work proposing philosophy as a way of life. I mean, in line with Pierre Hadot.
Yeah.
And so he takes up this notion of philosophy as a way of life, which Hadot had already shown was the kind of general understanding of philosophy in ancient times. And I think this has to do with the general conjuncture. You know, the long 60s or 70s had ended, and he does even say in the I think it is the Society Must Be Defended lectures, he says that, well, for some time now the ground has been trembling beneath our feet, and in a kind of general magnificent criticizability, or some strange word like this, he says, by which he means everything was possible to criticize, and this was a marvelous occasion, and things were happening. But you know, maybe he's also starting to realize that the ground is not trembling anymore,
No.
and that time has sort of passed, and therefore I think he is starting to think about what philosophy could be now or after that time.
I think what I'm getting at is I mean, how to connect his work Critique and Care of the Self.
Yeah.
To some extent, I feel Critique is more modern, Care of the Self is more ancient. I mean, to some extent,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
I would just know
Yeah.
my first association. So, I mean, he wants to show why the reading of ancient texts would still be relevant to us,
Yeah.
not just as a historical lesson, but because they show us something, and they show us what it means to be a philosopher in the world, to be engaged
Yeah.
in subjective practices, and they show us the possibility to ask the question, how do we become those types of subjects that we are?
Yeah.
So critique would be a way of narrating the history or story of how we became ourselves in order to show the possibility of becoming other. I know, would you say that this is a reasonable way of...
That critique is a way of...
A critique in the sense, I wanted to ask you what
Yeah.
critique is, but I'm just
Yeah.
going to propose a definition. That critique would be a way of, as it were, loosening the fixtures of ourselves.
Yeah.
And you're
Yeah.
doing, he says at
Yeah.
some point that rationality doesn't want to have its story told. So he's telling us these stories about rationality, subjectivity, reason,
Yeah.
in order to unscrew the fixtures of the present moment. This
Yeah.
would be like the history of the present, the way he perceives it.
Yeah.
So that's how to make ancient text relevant, not as a distant text, but
Yeah.
still with us today.
No, that's definitely a part of the problem, or an important way of understanding the problem of government and the relation to the self. And he also, at some point in the lectures of 1982, he says that any reflection of government and governmentality and so on cannot avoid passing through the element of the self and the relation of the self to self, or the care of the self. So I mean, and he does, I think he also, even when he's reading Seneca, he is sort of taking the parts that sort of rhymes with Kant, or that there are certain similar elements where Seneca says that you have to be led out of stultitia, or like a kind of, not stupidity, but a kind of state where you focus a bit on everything, and you know, and philosophy would need to lead you out of this, just like Kant talks about the enlightenment as an exit. You know, so. An exit from one's
self-imposed tutelage or something like that.
Self-incurred.
Self-incurred. Yeah.
But
sure.
so critique in that sense is already implicit in the care of the self.
Yeah.
You turn to yourself, but you always do it in relation to the world around you.
I mean, critique here, he has these texts, what is critique, and etc. He comes back to it, but I know this is an impossible question, but briefly, what is critique for Foucault?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I try to argue is that you can actually find a number of times where Foucault talks about philosophy in a very Kantian way, in line with the three critiques. So basically, critique would then be the first critique would be his own work, because that's basically what he in a large chunk of his what is critique lecture, he's basically defining, explaining, articulating his own work, his previous work, and as a kind of critique. So, and the second critique would be what he sort of studies in Plato, and when Plato goes to Syracuse and tries to act as a kind of advisor to the tyrant, Dionysus. So the second critique would be the work of the public intellectual, as you said before, more or less. And the third critique would be the definition he also gives in the What is Critique lecture, which is the art of not being governed thusly, or something like this. So the third critique would be a form of a care of the self, and also, or sometimes even outright revolt, or trying to break loose from whatever binds you or governs you. So that's, I mean, that would be three Foucauldian critiques that I propose that we can actually find himself describing his work in those terms. But then.
And Foucault was himself a very public intellectual. He was always, signing petitions and partaking in all kinds of public stuff. But I think one thing you put up here, which was perhaps more at the outset than in this book, but his involvement with the Polish Solidarność movement. Maybe you can say something. It's not that known, I think.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's been a book by Marcelo Hoffman. He sort of takes these issues and studies them a bit, but I have tried to go a bit further as well. And I mean, it is very interesting that his most substantial engagement with current events, political events, is the Solidarność movement in Poland in the early 1980s. And he works as he sort of functions as the treasurer for the Paris chapter of the Solidarność. He's going to Poland, he's writing petitions, he's doing interviews and so on. And I actually were in Poland in Gdansk to see in the Solidarność archives if there was anything to be studied, but I couldn't find anything. But a very interesting thing to me is that Foucault, in some of the interviews, when he talks about Solidarność, he says that, well, what's so specific about Solidarność is that it against the laws of against strikes, it is striking. Against the laws of organizing democratically, it organizes democratically, and so on. So, and he says that the form of the movement coincides with its goals, or something like this. And this is, to me, very interesting, because it's very close to how he describes the care of the self in ancient times, when he says that the care of the self is always a means to sort of the self, which so it means that the means and the ends coincide also in the notion of the care of the self. And that is why there is a kind of formal or a structural what do you say, recurring element in his late work on antiquity and his own political engagement in the present movement.
Yeah. It's interesting, because I think reading that used to be, and perhaps not today, but earlier, was that Foucault would be opposed to any kind of collective action.
Yeah.
He was criticized from the left, because he didn't like, the Communist Party. He was against these kind of large collective structures. So he, in a sense, perhaps not theoretically, but practically, was really an individualist thinker. But I think you show, or at least you want to show that this is not the case. And this is also a really different image of Foucault.
Yeah, but maybe it needs to be thought also in relation to his theoretical work, because, the Discipline and Punish was published in '75, and I think that sort of came as a culmination, in a way, of his own work on these issues of in his the prison information group, which he founded, and in which he was very active for a couple of years in the early 70s, and which was about self-organizing among French prisoners to gain better rights and so on. And this, I mean, if this grand work that he did with the prison information group, or not only grand but very what do you say, very substantial. He was devoting a lot of times and hours to this work, and this led to a theoretical work such as the Discipline and Punish. The question would be, of course, so what would be the theoretical work that would be the culmination of his engagement with the Solidarność movement? And also he also cooperated or discussed a bit with French labor unions. So what would be the culmination in a theoretical sense of that engagement? Well, we don't know, because he died before that happened. But it's an interesting question to think of, I think, and probably that would have happened in some way. Something would have been produced in this regard.